Ooh, nice place for this tank. I'm loving it on the sidewall. Look, here's another great TV room, if I'm going to call it that. We got the TV. We got probably the COVID-induced home office desk, and couch, sitting recliner here, all by the tank. Loving where this tank is set up. And it fits nicely on this wall. So for reference, this is a 6-foot tank and fits perfectly on this wall. Woodwork is a nice accent. It's not overbearing. This tank looks a little younger. We're not seeing grown-in SPS. Nothing wrong with that, just something I'm noticing off the bat to give me some context as I'm looking at this tank. All right, so we have 3 Neptune waves on here. The owner said there's actually 4, but one's just coming back from repair. So we have some mix of branch and let's call it regular rock. For those of you for reference, this is Cribsea Life Rock. We've got some LPS in here, nice looking elegance up front. Love the cleaner shrimp hanging out underneath the rock there. They tend to hang out there, which always adds some unique characteristics to the tank. So we're not fully grown in here, which is fine. We've got some pieces, larger pieces, some smaller pieces. Owner said he's just starting to get into SPS, but starting to struggle a little bit. So I think in time we'll have some coral on the tops of these rocks, some SPS pieces grown in. We've got some rock flower anemones here. We had a big old rose bubble tip off to the right. We'll get a look at that in a minute. We've got some mushrooms there in the back, some fuzzy mushrooms, which, as you all know, I'm not a mushroom fan, but look, the fuzzies are better than the purples or the blues or the red smooth type mushrooms. We got some Recordias and Siyumas over here too. Those are good choices for those of you that like mushrooms. Of course, there's always the bounce mushroom, which is very popular right now given the prices that it's drawing. So not an actual bounce there. It looks like a bounce. That's just a Recordia or a Yuma that's got some bubbles to it. So here we go. We have some SPS here. Some nice frags. I like that he went ahead and put them on the rocks. He's not leaving them on the sand bed, which I found never ends well for the corals. These pieces are nice size frags too. Let's pause for a minute and have a look at this guy. So as I'm starting to buy frags, when I can buy a frag with many branches like this green one we're looking at right here, I like that for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to grow faster nearly because there's more polyps on the piece. If we just have one little frag of SPS, one little single twig, let's call it, especially those of you that don't like SPS, they always call them twigs. So we have a single branch. It's going to have to encrust some, grow some, and before it's going to start kicking out some branches. That takes time. Now, if you're patient, that's cool. Nothing wrong with that. But if we have a frag that has multi-branches on it, we're already down the road a little bit. That's going to help it to grow faster and may help it to be a little stronger for your tank as well. So now this LPS piece here that's gone, the owner said that the file fish mowed that down overnight. Sometimes fish can go rogue. Just one of those things that you're going to have to deal with if you're dealing with those fish on the fringe. All right, if you're wondering why he has this piece of PVC piece here too, that was a piece of LPS that the firefish mowed down. Loving the blonde naso out front, the Tamini tang hanging in the back, and of course Dory, the hippo tang. Nice selection, the yellow tang as well. Good selection of algae eaters and the naso, the big one in the tank, but usually nasos don't cause any problems with other fish. No one really bothers them. They don't bother anyone else. We've got some, looks like Monty cap here. Okay, so I would put a different type of Monty that looks like it may be a Monty cap. If that's a Setosa, I'm okay with it. If it was a Monty cap, you know, let's stop here. That's not a bad placement for me for a Monty cap. Now, for those of you that are just tuning in, I'm not a Monty cap fan because they tend to take over and get really weedy. Then you are excited at first because you're like, wow, this thing's really growing and it's plating and it's starting to spiral. And then over time you're like, okay, I can grow this thing. Let's move it out. Removing it, it's very hard because they tend to overtake the rocks. You can never really get them to go away. That placement there, it's kind of in the shade. It's a good place for it to play down and grow. So I'm borderline on that one. I'm not going to cause a fuss about that. Loving the Zoa garden. Always love Zoas. He's got a mix of them here, so I'm going to dive in on the Zoa garden. We've got mainly greens. I would mix in some yellows. If you can find some reds, even some blues. Give your Zoa garden a little more depth to it. How it is now is okay, but I'm looking to really make this tank the next step. If you can remove some of those, I would do it, or add in some different colors to help really give some diversity to that zoa garden. Loving the big frog spawn. Oh, here we go. So we've got some different type zoas further down, some eagle eyes, and maybe some African's blues. And still mixing some reds to that zoa garden. I love where it's placed. Love how many zoas he has in there. I just want to see it be a little more diverse. Loving this swirly frog spawn. It's a nice place for it right underneath the power head, that Neptune Systems wave, giving it some flow there, letting it move around, which is always pleasing, especially to people who aren't into reef tanks. They see things move and they're like, wow. Speaking of movement, I'm eyeing this rose bubble tip, which looks like it's getting a fair amount of flow on it. Maybe borderline beat to death, but it could move and it's not moving, so clearly it's happy with how much flow it's getting from that Neptune Systems wave. For some of you, that may look like too much flow. To me, I'm actually surprised that it hasn't moved out of the way, but it's positioned there, and if it's happy, then hey, leave it. Hopefully it stays right there so you can build your SPS around it. It's a give and a take with anemones. For me, I think it's worth it. Now, one thing I'm seeing right here in the back, back up there, is this gyre that's in the back wall, right over there to the left. Now what I would do is I would take it off the back wall and I would put it, in this case, to the left, since he's waiting for that wave to come back from service. I would have that thing on the left to spread out the flow with one power head. There's nothing wrong with having two waves, but putting that gyre in the back, no wider than this tank is, front to back, you're not going to be able to turn it up very high because it's going to move your sand. So I would give preference to the gyre to being on either end of the tank. That way you can turn it up and create more flow down the distance, spread out that flow as well. If you really want any flow front to back, I would take one of your waves, put on your overflow box, pointing it at an angle. You have those trapezoidal looking overflow box. So instead of pointing it flat on the back, pointing towards forward, because again, you're not going to be able to turn it up much because if you're going to move your sand around, I would put it on your overflow box and shoot it kind of diagonally down the tank, but it would also let you angle it towards the front pane and help you mix up your flow as well. Little tweaks. I'm liking that he has as much power heads and as much internal flow on this tank. I just want to change it up a little bit, make it a little more dynamic than just on the ends or a strong power head on the back that we can't really turn up. Loving the mix of fish here. Okay, so he might not have dabbled into Anthias yet. I would add some Anthias to this tank to help give it some more, to really help it fill in. We've got some wrasses here, some dotty backs, some nice tangs. I would fill in the Anthias to help give that tank lots of motion. I like the dartfish, liking the clowns. Of course, the clowns aren't anywhere, of course, close to the sea anemone. Stupid clownfish. Go get in that nice big rose bubble tip down there. Swim that way. Go that way and get in that bubble tip. But again, I would fill in with some Anthias. Lyre tails are great. Bartletts are great. Both of those, get a trio of them, 6 of them. The key there is just to make sure you feed them a couple times a day to really make them healthy over the long term. Overall though, this is a tank that's got its legs underneath it. It's starting to grow in, it's starting to prove itself. He'll get locked in on his SPS, and then we'll really see this thing fill out. Overall though, nice little starting, let's say, I don't want to say starter tank, starting in the sense that the tank's over the hump, it's starting to grow in, the owner's starting to get used to it, knows what it likes. Things will start to fill in. If the owner isn't taking lots of photos at this point, please go do it. You may look at this and say, well, it's not much to look at, but go ahead and take those photos, and then as it gets grown in, you can look back on it and be like, oh yeah, I remember when my tank used to look like that. All right, we have a Neptune Systems apex over here on the left. All right, so it is underneath the water line, which is usually inevitable with this. And the tank has a canopy, so look, I could get picky and say, yeah, I could get splashed on it, but in this case, water getting around the canopy, splashing on that, probably a low incidence of that. Make sure you have drip loops in there, but overall, I understand sometimes that's all the room you have for placement. I'll let that one go. All right, so underneath the tank here, we have a Clear-Sea roller. We have an algae scrubber over here to the right, which we're gonna get a look at. Taking up, looks like pretty full sump. We're gonna get a walk around of this thing, but everything, all the space that he has is utilized. Something to keep in mind. As you're designing your system, as this one shows you, even a 6-foot tank may seem like a lot of room under there. Room can go fast. So make sure you're leaving yourself plenty of room in the sump. At the same time, you have to balance that with other things that are going to go under your tank. Like, does your ATO have to go under there? Does your trident have to fit underneath there? While I like big sumps and I like getting the biggest sump that I can, if everything is going underneath the tank, you often have to balance how much room you're going to give to the sump and how much room you need to leave yourself for other components, like we'll see with this build. We have a trident up front. We have leftover Captain Morgan for the waste container. BRS dual media reactor in the front running carbon and GFO, and an algae scrubber with a roller and a skimmer, RTK, which we're going to get a look at in a minute. I'm curious about nutrient levels in this tank. There's really enough to power all of those things, considering how much nutrients is getting taken out by the roller and by GFO and carbon and by this algae scrubber. Okay, the energy bar in the back. One concern is water dripping. Bigger concern can be is getting to that thing. If you have to unplug something, you got to reach all the way back in there to get to it. So if I could relocate that to the side, I would do that to make it a little easier on myself. It's not going to make or break your tank, but it's certainly going to make maintenance easier for you. And if you need to unplug something in a hurry, you're not trying to reach back there and find what you're going for. All right, a current USA flux system on here, providing some flow down in the sump and lighting as well. So we have different types of components we've seen. A lot of times we see Radions, AI products. Now we're using the current USA, and it's getting the job done on this tank. Good to see a mix of ecosystems here. Something we don't see a lot of as well. This is RK2 skimmer. Certainly a capable skimmer, an external skimmer. He's running it externally, so it's taking up some space. So those of you that are debating internal versus external protein skimmers, case in point, externals tend to take up space, so make sure you have room for it underneath your sump. All right, we have a dose up front that's done for automatic water changes. That's going to make his maintenance a little easier for him. And he has another one running Tropic Marin, and he has a third one that's running two-part, and he has this ATO container over here. So I'm going to come back to the ATO container because I want to make a point about that. Keep in mind, we have all these components underneath the 6-foot tank. Again, 6-foot tank may seem big, but look how much room is getting used up by everything. Now, in this case, everything fits underneath his tank, so he may not have the option for a fish room or any kind of storage area next to the tank where he can hide everything. So everything's got to go underneath here. So we have a large sump with an algae scrubber, with a trident, with an ATO container, with an external skimmer. So you can see things are quite full underneath there. So keep that in mind as you're designing your system, or if you're upgrading your system. Leave yourself some space if you have to. It can go very quickly. Now in this case, he's getting it all done. Just notice that things are packed in there. So there's some give and a take. Certainly you don't want to not have a tank because you don't think you can fit everything underneath there because your spouse may not want to see it. Just keep in mind, you know, things are going to get tight. Speaking of getting tight, that FMM back there, if he had the space with the cords, I would move it over to the right as well, above that ATO, make it easier to get to that thing. Look, there's some give and take there. You're probably not accessing that FMM very often, but if you do, you don't want to be back there, reach underneath there, getting the plug to fit in there. If you got the space and you got the cord length, move it over to the right, make it just that much easier for you to service. Overall, we're getting a lot done in this sump. Lots of components to make his life easier with dosing, with monitoring, with water changes. Really curious about nutrient levels on this tank, where they're hanging out with all this filtration that we have going on. Overall though, look, he's got a lot going on. He's got lots of pumps to do it. Some of those current pump-like controllers are running pumps as well. So look, we've got a lot going on. Just shows you how fast your sump can fill up quickly. And that's not that bad. I'm just using this as an example. For those of you thinking that you're gonna have a lot of space under there, just make sure you utilize it and make sure you measure things out, because things can go quickly. Certainly getting in here to swap out a pump, service a pump, you got a lot going on. There's a give and a take. Now, personally, what I would do, if he had the space and mainly for the size of the pump, if I could have one return pump that's driving the return, that's driving the algae scrubber, driving the skimmer as well, I would do that. Maybe 2 pumps to help simplify your life, as opposed to having all those different pumps driving all the different components. You can get it down instead of 3 to 2, maybe even to 1, I would do it. Now some people would say, wait, Why do you want one pump driving everything? Because if it goes down, then you're hosed. There's some truth to that. And if your single return pump, which is also driving your skimmer, and your algae scrubber goes down, I found it's very easy to get replacements. You can easily have a backup, even like mag drive pump, which simply pumps water back into your tank. In this case, there's not a lot of head pressure because the sump is right underneath the tank. You could easily find a mag 9.5, maybe even a 12 that's going to drive everything to keep you going until you get your return pump that you were using service. So there's a give and a take there. The more pumps we have, the more power we're using, the more plumbing that we have to deal with underneath the tank. As you can see, we're packed in here. But again, it's getting it done. It's not like that's bad. There's some give and a take when you're trying to fit everything underneath your tank with sump and all the filtration. So let me back up here, take another quick look at the display, because that's what we're really here for. I'm liking where this tank is going. Once it gets its feet underneath and with the SPS, things were going to grow in well. One thing I'm not seeing, now this may partially be because his filefish ate it, which he said his filefish has now moved on, getting into some closed type brains or open brains. If you can have success with those, you have some LPS in here already. Curious to see if you try some of those out just to fill in your aquascape. Put in some Lobos in here, fill out your diversity of corals, which you've started on already, which look pretty good, just to make this thing, you know, more diverse. Really show what you can do in a reef tank, show off the different types of corals, how some move, how some don't, talking to people about different types of LPS. It's always fascinating. Just give you a little more diversity in here as your tank is maturing, as you start to get your legs underneath this thing and really fill it out. Great start here. Lots of things going for it, some tweaks to dial things in, and the really fun part is lots more capacity for fish, lots more capacity for corals. So start buying, start filling this thing in. Love to see an update on this thing in a year.